Hello, everybody, and welcome to Adventures in History. Hope your world is doing well. Hope everybody's having a good day or night or whatever time zone you are in. I hope that it's going well for you. Matt, good to see you. Zaraniah, good to see you. Fall Machine, welcome in. Indeed, it is time to talk government and politics. We've taken a little bit of time off. Tito Nitrogen, what's up? Welcome. Took a little bit of time off for some viewer request streams on Israel and then one on farting, which was kind of funny. We will be getting back to the series of streams on the history of Israel. I wanted to do this stream tonight, mostly because I wanted everybody to remember that we do also have an ongoing series on the history of government and politics. So this is something that we have been working on now for the majority of this year. I have obviously not done an entry every single week this year, but we've had a lot of other kind of streams going on too. So we're going to be probably either alternating or maybe trying to do 2 streams a week again for the future. I don't know how well that's going to work. I'll be going back to school starting tomorrow. Today is the last day of summer break. So we'll see how all of that stuff shakes out and whether or not I'll feel like streaming a couple of nights a week. But we will be getting back to more regularly scheduled programming because my schedule after about Labor Day is going to be much more regular in nature. So I won't be lazing about nearly as much. We'll just say it nicely that way, right? Yeah, so hope everybody's doing well. We're going to kind of kick it off and get started tonight. So we have been working on the history of government and politics, and this was in response to just a lot of questions about government and politics that I got asked, especially at the end of last year after the elections in the United States, and then, of course, beginning this year with the change in government and how things are going crazy and all of that stuff. For those of you that might be watching the VOD later in time, this is August of 2025. So obviously there is a lot of interest in what government is and where government comes from and what we can qualify or expect out of certain types of governments. So that's where the origin of the series came from, and we have been working on that going all the way back to some anthropological stuff, and now we are getting into the early part of what we might call the Reformation or the Enlightenment. These things are sort of nebulous concepts. We did talk in the last episode about some pretty big figures in the early political philosophy world. We looked at Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Filmer. And anyway, we did some of that stuff in last episode. Tonight we're going to be looking specifically at this concept of church and state. And I mentioned in the last episode that we would be talking a lot more about stuff like Christian scripture and theology and stuff like that in upcoming episodes. German history guy, welcome, and hello to you as well. So we need to talk about religion. And we've talked a lot about religion already in this series, and we've talked about the relationship between governments and political ideology, using religion as a basis or as a prop, or trying to blend religion, government, and politics together. But we're going to start looking tonight at some people that might not think that way. And this is going to bring about a lot of different problems and a lot of different issues. And millions of people are going to die over it. So, yay! But let's start with sort of the guy that got it all going. That guy, Martin Luther. So we're not going to go into the entire history of the Protestant Reformation if you're interested in that, that might be a viewer request that we could do later on. But for the purposes of tonight, what we want to look at specifically is a particular idea that Martin Luther put forward. And I should probably put that here. And then I should change this to this one. We'll just put that on multiple lines. If I could spell. The Two Kingdoms Doctrine. Now, obviously, Martin Luther has a lot of beef with the Catholic Church. This is where the whole Protestant Reformation thing starts in the first place. The theses, yes, the nailing of theses to the door of the chapel. This is 1517, 1518. But the specific concept here that we're looking at is getting church and state looked at in different ways. What's up, Cliff? Good to see you. So let me explain what the Two Kingdoms Doctrine is. So according to Luther, God had set up two different systems, and he called these kingdoms, for earth. And these kingdoms were the religious kingdom and what we could call either the secular kingdom or the political kingdom, and that these two were different things. And according to Luther's theology, the religious side or the religious kingdom was supposed to be ruled through the church. So here this is like capital C church. And the political or secular kingdom should be ruled by the government. And the church is one thing and the government is another thing. Now, it's worth pointing out that specifically here, what Luther is complaining about was the power that the Catholic Church had over governments in Europe. I think that if you've been with us, or if you know even broad strokes of history, you'll understand that the Catholic Church, especially in Europe, was incredibly powerful. In many ways, it wielded political, temporal, secular authority alongside of its religious authority. And Luther was very big against that. He did not like the idea that the Catholic Church was so political. He said that the political world is one kingdom that should be ruled by the government. The religious world is one that should be ruled by the church and church leadership, and they shouldn't be the same thing. Now, this by itself is a very trying concept. And there were a lot of people inside of Europe that saw this doctrine and had very strong reactions to it. Obviously, the Catholic Church does not care for this. A lot of the monarchies in the European world did not care for this very much. Luther was living in the Holy Roman Empire at the time. The guy that was the leader of the Holy Roman Empire at the time was Charles V, who was one of the most powerful leaders of European history at that point. He very much did not like this idea. So who does like it? Well, there are a lot of people that saw this Two Kingdoms doctrine as a way to leverage their individual political power by taking a religious stance, which is an interesting thing here. So we're asserting a division between church and state, but we're doing this from a religious position. This is very different than the way that most people in today's world want to argue the separation between church and state. Most of the people that argue against church and state being mixed are now coming from the secular or political side. But at the time when this idea first came out, the idea was I can make a religious decision that's going to have political impact, right? And if I don't want to follow the monarch that the church chose, I can make a religious statement that I don't follow the church anymore. And of course, this has the domino effect of delegitimizing the monarchy, because if the church is the only thing propping them up, they don't have contemporary power. And if I'm interpreting scripture the way that I'm supposed to be, according to Martin Luther, the church should not be the backing power of the government, and the government should not be the backing power of the church. The church should be run by scripture and through theological authority. The government should run by laws and temporal authority or secular authority, and these two should never meet. You can tell that this is going to be a problematic concept. Now, we're not going to go through we're going to go through this stuff sort of in chunks. That's why we have Reformation chunk and then Revolution chunk. We're going to come back to how all of this stuff is going to play out sort of at the second half of the stream tonight. But for the moment, let's look at how other people in the Reformation are going to also take political stances. So we can move from Martin Luther to one of the other really large Protestants, a guy named John Calvin, who is, obviously the guy that started Calvinism, but he's going to look at this two kingdoms doctrine quite a bit differently. And he puts forward what we call the consistory model. And you're like, what the heck is that word? A consistory is basically a fancy word that Protestants want to use to mean something like a church council. So in the Catholic tradition of both Orthodox Catholicism and Roman Catholicism, you have the history of these church councils. You can call them councils, you can call them synods, you can call them pretty much a lot of different things here. But the point is that these church councils had humongous impacts both politically and religiously. Now, Calvin sees Luther's concept here that church and state should be different, but he would prefer the church to act in some of the ways that the government was acting at the time. He would still argue that there is a place for a temporal or a secular government, and that the religious group should be the religious group, but he wants to bring more power to the religious side in his consistory model. So if you look at the consistories that were set up under Calvin's pretexts, these are mostly in the 1540s, and almost all of them are in Switzerland. But basically, the way that he wants to do it is that the church leaders are going to punish everything that is a spiritual offense. So a lot of the stuff that would be normally categorized under political law or governmental law are now going to be run by the church. So if you do something like commit adultery, obviously there were laws on the books about what happened when you commit adultery, but under the consistory model, this is something that would fall under church jurisdiction. If you are publicly drunk, or if you curse a lot, or if you do anything that would break any sort of religious law, Calvin would say that you should be judged by the church, and that if there are laws that exist that would cover these things, the government should back off and let the church run this stuff. And specifically here, one of the things that Calvin wanted to do was preserve the idea of excommunication, right? So this is something that was big in the Catholic faith, where, if you don't follow what the Pope said, you could get kicked out of the church. And of course, according to Catholic tradition, that would mean that you don't get to go to heaven anymore. Calvin wants to have that as a kind of a weapon that these consistories get to use, that you get kicked out of the group for being a bad religious figure. Obviously here, this doesn't sit well with a lot of the governmental authorities, and the consistories don't last with unlimited power for too terribly long. The longest running one runs until like the middle, or like 3/4 of the way through the 1700s. Excommunication doesn't sound very Jesus-y. Well, that's true, Maddie. But Calvin wanted these consistories, these church groups, to have the same sort of scary power that a government could have, right? If the government could kill you. Don Factorial, what's up, man? Don, it's good to see you. I have been absent from pretty much all of your streams lately. I watched you play Sifu the second time that you played it a little bit, but I lurked. My inattention to Don's stream should not equate to your inattention to Don's streams. You should go give Don a follow. Don's a great dude that does math education and also plays video games. Don, how did your stream go? What were you up to today? So hope you're doing well. Let me try to catch up with chat here. And everybody coming in from Don's stream, hello, my name is Shane. I teach history and sociology and anthropology at college. I stream usually some version of history content here. We are currently on our 13th installment of the history of government and politics, and we're talking about the Protestant Reformation and how that affected a lot of the political ideas in Europe, which of course are going to be the ones that directly turn into our political ideas here in the United States. It's something that can get easily weaponized without getting too murdery. Indeed. That's one of the big things here, because the church didn't have the power to threaten someone's life on earth, so they should have something that they can hold over someone, perhaps eternally, right? And lo, I say to you, cast out this one dude for ticking me off. Exactly, right? It went well. It was math day. You did some studying and managed to do a tough physics question someone gave you. Interesting. Don, are you in the process of moving, or have you already moved? I know that you are relocating. They didn't expect the Inquisition. They did not expect the Inquisition. Nobody expects the Inquisition, right? So we're talking about John Calvin. The consistory model is basically his attempt at creating some level of religious authority that would oversee people's activities after the Protestant Reformation. You're about to start moving this weekend. It was your last stream for a while. Okay, well, everybody go follow Don. And then when he gets back online in his new domicile, we will love bomb him with lots of eyeballs for his first stream back. So there is that. All right. So again, this is mostly going to happen in Switzerland. There are a lot of other Calvinists in the world at the time. Most of them are over in France. Calvin's ideas, specifically here relating to these consistories, don't necessarily get a lot of traction there, but it's not necessarily out of the potential. We'll just say it kind of that way. There's going to be a lot of trouble with Calvinists in France, and we'll talk about that again on the back half of the stream. All right, so we've got two reformers. They've got two different ways to approach this. How about this guy? Henry VIII. Henry VIII is a really important reformer. Not a good person, but a very important reformer. Specifically here because he's the guy that comes up with this Church of England concept. We're not going to go through the whole story of Henry VIII. He's a dude that wanted a divorce from his Spanish wife. The church wouldn't give it to him, da-da-da-da-da. He declares that he is the head of a new church organization. And this is going to be Reformation, but it's going to be Reformation in a very, very different way. right? Henry's concept of Reformation is the king should just be the head of the church. So this is still part of the Reformation, but it's not Luther and it's not Calvin. This is just Henry, right? So he creates the Church of England. What is the Church of England? Well, it is an autonomous church that is run by the king. So he merges fully the idea here of church and state. He was the head of the state and he was the head of the church. Now, obviously, this has a whole ton of issues that cause lots of consternation. And again, we'll talk about a lot of these things. I declare bankruptcy, right? He changed the rules, exactly. I declare that I am the head of a new branch of the church. Yes. And to do so, what is he going to pull from? Well, he pulls from a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about previously. The concept of the divine right of kings, right? This is an idea that we've covered many times here in this series. The idea that God himself has chosen certain people to be the heads of state. And if God has chosen them to be the head of state, they should also be the head of the religion. There are also appeals that go all the way back to the Byzantine era with the concept of Caesaropapism. This is something that we covered very briefly several episodes ago, but the idea that the emperor should be the sole head of all authority, not just political authority and military authority, but also religious authority, right? He who has the biggest hat gets to make up the new rules. Henry II, upon hearing about Henry VIII, that was not something I was aware that I could do. Yeah, exactly. I didn't know I could do that. Henry II had his own whole thing with politics, and we talked about him a couple of episodes ago, right? So what does this Church of England really do? Well, it sets up a new alternative, right? We've had this before, but it hadn't happened for a very, very long time in Christianity, where the head of the political organization was also considered to be the head of the religion. You know, it's been, at this point, probably 700, 800 years in Europe since anybody had tried that. This is going to require a lot of justification. And Henry actually had a ton of lawyers to try to pull up all of these examples of things and references to things and justifications for the political side. But he also has a mass of theologians, people that are his friends inside of the church. And he has them work up these big articles that explain why he has the authority to do this on the religious side of things. So what we've got is a lot of different stuff, a lot of different ideas happening, and a lot of stuff being published because of this, right? So if we've got all of these writings, this is obviously going to be stuff that more people read, which is going to add to the larger atmosphere of political philosophy and political theory in the first place. So there we go. The Bobs to Henry VIII. What is exactly that you do around here? Today I learned that Henry VIII had his own heritage foundation. Yes. And they very much had like Project Church of England instead of Project 2025. And there was an enormous amount of propaganda that was produced to justify this move. And those people became instrumental in his new church leadership. Project 1585, right. So this isn't something that is really surprising, and there's not really very much new under the sun. But this is going to have ramifications. What's up, Silver? Good to see you, man. So obviously this is going to have big ramifications, and we'll come back to this in just a second. So let's talk about a group that a lot of people don't tend to talk about that much, and that is a group called the Anabaptists. And there are a lot of different people that fall under the Anabaptist sort of line here. There's Menno Simmons and all kinds of different individuals. But the Anabaptists are an interesting group. They have a lot of very unique political ideology and theological ideology. Yes, so the Amish are a group of Anabaptists. So just brief history, because a lot of people probably aren't super familiar with Anabaptists. The idea here is they take their name from Anabaptist, so being baptized again. The idea is that you should not be baptized until you are an adult and make a confessionary statement to join a church. This obviously is going to set them apart from a lot of the other groups. They don't consider themselves Protestant. They don't consider themselves Catholic or Orthodox. They consider themselves to be sort of an autonomous group within the larger Christian ideology. Yeah, so the Hutterites and the Mennonites, all these people are groups of Anabaptists. These people are going to rub shoulders with the Puritans. They're going to have a lot of influence in a very brief period in some really important ways. So, what's their political ideology? Why are we talking about them now? Well, they believed ultimately that communities should be ruled and governed purely by religious means. So they don't really believe in a separation of church and state, right? Each of the two up high, what's going on? Good to see you, my friend. They are not a big fan of the Catholic leadership format or the Catholic leadership style. So they don't believe like Pope, Archbishop, etc., etc. What they want to do is form their own little groups that are completely self-governing. So basically their own little communes, like what Maddie is referring to here. Yeah, like a weird hardcore Christian commune. Sort of. That's, I mean, we could quibble about words, but that's not too far away from the idea here. They needed this separation for a few reasons. Number one, they saw existing non-Anabaptist religious leadership as corrupt, right? They didn't believe that the Catholic Church or the other Protestants had any kind of legitimacy in their scriptural interpretation. Obviously, they're a little bit more friendly with the Protestants than the Catholics, but they're not really thinking that those other groups have it right. They also think that most of the secular authority that existed was designed very poorly and was also super corrupt. And if we're talking about the period of time here in the 15 and 1600s, there's obviously a lot of corruption in politics and government, just like there is now. But to the Anabaptists, any sort of secular authority should be subservient to Scripture, and religious authority was the most important concept. The Bible rules all. If there was a political or secular idea that disagreed with Scripture, it was wrong. There wasn't any room for debate. So what these people wanted to do was set up their own little groups that were away from other groups, and they wanted to live basically unmolested from the outside world. And if we look at the surviving Anabaptist groups today, like Mennonites, like Amish people, they still do the same sort of thing, right? They want to live in a group with only their people. They don't want to be governed the same way as the people outside of their group do. Obviously, here in the United States, there are a lot of legal distinctions that allow special treatment for the Amish because of our separation of church and state. They don't have to follow the same sort of laws that we do. There are a lot of differences that they get basically covered because of their religious beliefs for that other people don't, right? So the groups are very different. What's up, Celestial? Catholics be like, don't take a walk with our intellectual property. Yeah, the Anabaptists would say, Catholics, you've done it wrong for 1,000 years. You need to get out of the way and let somebody else have a go. Yeah, so Mennonites are different than Amish, and even the individual Amish groups are different than other groups, and different Mennonite groups are different. There are different groups that hold different covenants, but basically here, they are going to have very specific political beliefs that are not going to line up with anybody else's political beliefs, and they have religious beliefs that are not going to line up with anybody else's religious beliefs, which makes them incredibly isolated in the particular period of time that we're talking about. So, as a way to transition here from our Reformation idea part to our Revolution idea part, let's talk a little bit about the Anabaptist attempt at setting up their own government. And the most famous one is called the Munster Rebellion, which is 1530. Sorry, I keep forgetting that I have hotkeys set to that. 1534 to 1535. All right. So, what's the Munster Rebellion? Well, basically a bunch of Anabaptists take over Munster. And it was after the Addams family reconciliation. That's good. I like that. So the Munster Rebellion was when a bunch of Anabaptists took over Munster, and they turned it into an Anabaptist collective. They put their church leaders at the head of the group, and everybody that was there was forced to participate in their church leadership. You have a lot of Russian Anabaptist style folks here. So Germany today is still where a lot of the Anabaptist origins trace back to. There are certain Anabaptist groups today that speak a very old version of German. There are a certain group of Mennonites that speak a very old version of Russian. So they're still around. So for about a year, Munster gets run under this Anabaptist group. But they start running afoul of the government. Number one, they refuse to pay their taxes because they don't see the government as being legitimate. And they say, our money is God's money, and we should use our money the way that God said so, and we're not going to pay our taxes. Now, let's overlook the fact that the Bible says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. They're not going to pay their taxes the right way. They also don't pay attention when the political leaders of the zone start saying things like, you can't just take people's property, right? Like you can't just declare that you own the whole region and run things however you would like, because that goes against existing governmental regulations. And of course, the people leading the Munster Rebellion go, your regulations don't matter because they're not based in biblical scripture the way that we interpret it, so you can take your regulations and shove them. What ends up happening is the military shows up, right? Your grandparents in Iowa have a huge community of Amish around them. What did they think of Jehovah's Witnesses? So the Jehovah's Witnesses didn't even exist at this time yet. What's up, Chris? Good to see you. Yeah, they were a sovereign people. Sort of. They were a religiously sovereign people. It's amazing how many of these groups just end up being libertarians. Sort of. But when the Holy Roman Empire shows up with the military, the Anabaptists don't back down. And over the course of about 3 months, the army lays siege to the whole city and region until the people inside of Munster basically get sick of the Anabaptists and start helping to rat them out and turn them over. During the course of the siege, Somewhere around 3,000 people ended up dying, some of them from starvation, some of them from being killed by the military, some of them for being tried and killed inside of the commune, right? Uh, there were starvation issues. Yeah, so they didn't have any food, or they didn't have enough food. And of course, if you were any level of uh, disrespectful to the religious authority, you didn't get food. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. We start seeing that being used as a really horribly referenced scriptural thing again. Obviously, the whole thing here is based on their particular interpretations of stuff. But anyway, by the end of it, when the military breaks into Munster, they're going to capture the leaders of the rebellion. They're going to put them on public trial. They're going to torture them until they confess to doing all of the things that they obviously did, and then some more. And then they are going to be publicly executed. And the cages that were used to display their bodies are still hanging up in Munster today as a sort of, hey, this is what happens when you decide to go crazy and Anabaptist your way out of the government. So that is the biggest and most recognized attempt at Anabaptists doing Anabaptist things. This is not the only time that they tried to do that. This is not the only place that they tried to do that. This was just the most successful one. There were dozens of Anabaptist communities that tried to break off and do their own individual thing. Some of them got in trouble for claiming land that they didn't own. So let's just move out into the middle of nowhere. We're going to start a community here. Well, did you own that land? Well, God owns all the land, so blah, 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 blah. You can't really claim that it's ours or yours because it's ours. So that kind of stuff. And this happens over a lot of Central European regions, some in France, some in Switzerland, some in Germany. You can't just claim a state, pretty much, right? You're starting to like these folks, except for the belief in the myth. Recall from the video that one of the first battles was technically won by the commune because the military got drunk and messed up the assault. Well, we are talking about Germany. So this is 1534 to 1535, Maddie. Yes, this is Munster, Germany. Mm-hmm. Oh, no, you're fine. Don't worry about it. So we've got religious ideas. We've had religious reform. Are we going to see political change coming from it? Yes. Does it always go the way that we want it to? No. Does it change the political atmosphere of Europe? Absolutely. All right, so let's look a little bit more at what happens in the Holy Roman Empire, because this is going to be one of the biggest and most important countries in Europe at the time, and it's going to be a sort of bellwether for how a lot of these other countries are going to handle this stuff, because the Protestant Reformation does start in the Holy Roman Empire, and it's definitely going to have more of a immediate impact in the Holy Roman Empire than it does in some of the other places. You don't know why you thought that the Anabaptists were more in the 1800s. Well, there was a lot of migration during the 1800s of Anabaptists, especially to the New World. And it's not just to the United States. There are a lot of Anabaptist movements that end up in places like Central America, right? Today, the northernmost state in Belize is pretty much completely run by Mennonites, to the point that some of the road signs there are written in their version of German, right? There's some in South America. There are going to be Mennonite groups in Asia, Amish groups all over Canada, United States. So there's a lot of migration and an attempt at spreading the Mennonite way of things in the 1800s. you're getting Roma vibes from them. Well, they definitely want to put out Roma vibes, right? So, what's going on in the Holy Roman Empire? Well, from 1517, when the Reformation started, until about 1555, there's going to be unrest. And this is mostly going to be unrest between the nobility and Charles V, Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, protected by the Pope, one of the most powerful men on earth at the time. This guy did not like the Protestants. He saw them as an existential threat. He tried to kill Martin Luther. All of that stuff is, sort of part of the larger Protestant Reformation, but specifically here politically, what are we looking at? Well, we see a lot of nobility, and especially newer nobility and smaller nobility, start standing up for Protestants. And they start seeing Lutheranism as a way to extricate themselves from the larger Holy Roman imperial structure, right? If they didn't like the way that the church was going, or if they didn't like the way that the Habsburgs were leading the Holy Roman Empire, or if they didn't specifically like Charles V himself, they could say, well, I'm Lutheran. And Lutherans don't recognize the legitimacy of a sovereign that is propped up purely by the Catholic Church. And this causes a lot of trouble, because then do they pay taxes? Do they answer summons for military? Are they expected to give loans to the crown? Do they get to call their loans that exist to the crown? Do they get to charge the crown interest now? There's a lot of debate about how exactly this political Reformation stuff is going to work with the religious change. And there is violence. There are people that take up arms to defend Lutheranism. There are battles between Lutheran groups and Catholic groups. Charles V is forced to mobilize the army on multiple occasions. And that causes further issue, because when you call up the army and tell them you're going to go fight your own people, that doesn't sit very well. Imagine if my brother is one of these Protestants and I'm a Catholic and I get called to go kill my brother. Do I go kill my brother, or do I, stay true to the bonds of the family? There are a lot of these problems that end up causing an issue. They had an escape from their ill circumstances by hiding behind a bigger movement. Exactly, Celestial. That was part of it, for sure. Who made him king? Yeah, well, here's the thing about the Holy Roman Emperor. He was elected. A lot of these nobles held a position in the Holy Roman Empire of elector. And when the emperor died, it was expected for the church, the Catholic Church here, to hold an election. And these high-level electors would then go vote on who they wanted to be emperor. Now, of course, the sway of the Catholic Church here was enormous, and the weight of the Habsburg family and their power and their money was behind this, and it was pretty sure that we're going to pass this father to son, but there wasn't necessarily a direct guarantee. So what happens if a sizable enough portion of the electors end up going Protestant? Does that mean they can elect a Protestant to the Holy Roman Imperial throne? And that's a big no-no, because then you've got a Protestant running a Catholic group. This doesn't sit very well. So we've got to stomp these people out, right? Go kill my brother. Am I LARPing the Bible now? Maybe. Did Protestant groups choose to have bishops? If not, was it just to turn away from the dogma? So they did have church leadership, and depending on which Protestant group you're talking about, they are going to have very clearly delineated church leadership organizations. It just depends on which one you're going to go with. Which brother? Oh, haha. Okay. So what ends up happening is the nobles are going to basically force Charles's hand. and they're going to get a document made called the Peace of Augsburg. Now, the Peace of Augsburg was designed at ending the physical violence and creating a working arrangement between the nobles and the king or the emperor, right? And basically what it said was each individual noble in the Holy Roman Empire is going to get to choose their religion. But, here's the kicker, I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus.
Claire, thank you so much for 15 months of being Spartacus. Hope that you're doing well. Hope that everything is going okay in your world. Got to hit the hay. Sorry to bail so soon. That's true. That's fine. That's fine. You're very welcome. Hope you have a good night. Augsburg shows up often in history. Seems like an important place. It's a city where a lot of stuff kind of goes down. Yeah. So, in the Peace of Augsburg, again, each noble is going to get to pick whether or not they're going to be Lutheran or Catholic. But here's the rub. If your noble picks Lutheran and you're a Catholic, well, guess what? You've got to convert to Lutheranism because they're not going to have Catholic churches in your territory. And if you're a Lutheran and your noble chooses Catholic, well, guess what? You've got to go to a Catholic church because there aren't going to be Lutheran churches in your area. So this is not a perfect solution. And in fact, it causes almost as many problems as it solves. You always love to interrupt me at the most inopportune times. You're a slacker and you forgot it was Thursday. That's fine. That's fine. It's been a weird week. It's my last week of summer. Today feels kind of like a Sunday because I've got to go to work tomorrow, but then I had the weekend off. It's weird. It's weird. So do I think the 30 Years' War were better? Well, we're getting to the 30 Years' War in just a second. We're going to put a pin in Holy Roman Empire, and we're going to go over to France for a bit. Spoilers, yeah. And we're going to talk about the French Wars of Religion. And these are intermittent, but they run basically from 1562 to 1598. All right. Yeah, Kelly, back to school tomorrow. Well, I got to go back tomorrow, and then Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday will all be meetings, and then students come back Thursday next week. Yeah, Claire, I still haven't figured out how to get the videos to work. I keep saying I'm going to fix that, and then I don't. Zybastu Carthaginosis. That's a big one. That's a powerful name. Powerful name. Zybastus Carthaginiensis. That's a powerful name. Thank you so much for the follow. Welcome to the adventure. Favorite GIF ever? There we go. Right. Okay, so what's going on with French Wars of Religion? Well, largely, this is Calvinist versus the crown, right? In France, the Calvinists take this name, the Huguenots, or Huguenots, you can call it whatever you want to. But the issue here is similar to what's going on over in the Holy Roman Empire. The idea here is we have people that are Protestants, French Calvinists. The crown is very, very, very Catholic. And how do we handle nobles converting? And the answer is we fight each other. And the French Wars of Religion are going to be the most violent political responses that we've seen so far. There are going to be about 2 million people that end up dying. There are 3 different sort of periods of time where the fighting is really, really bad. it's pretty messy. And like the Italians get involved and the Catholic Church gets involved, and Catherine de Medici is the queen over three different sons and her husband, and maybe killed her kids. Who knows? There's a lot of mess, right? There's a lot of mess going on right now. Speaking of Trump, if Trump gives Alaska back to Russia, does this mean France will take back the Louisiana territories? I don't think so, and I also don't think that he would give away land. He's all about trying to expand territory, so I don't see that as being a big deal. You never realized that the French could deal with this uprising. I thought they stayed Catholic the whole time. Well, the Catholic leadership of the country definitely did, but the French wars of religion are not going to be just Catholic versus Catholic. This is Catholic versus French Protestants, and it gets nasty. This is going to end with a big declaration called the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes, right? Basically what's going to happen here, the French throne was sort of vacant. There are a lot of different claimants to the throne. One of the potential claimants was actually a French Calvinist, and he agreed to convert to Catholicism so that he could become Henry IV, King of France. And when he did so, he passed the Edict of Nantes, which basically said that you had religious rights in France to choose between your Calvinism and your Catholicism. So this, by the way, is not going to hold very well. And we'll talk about it falling apart here in just a little bit. What about Spain? Spain at this time was very, very Catholic. We don't see a lot of Protestantism happening in Spain. They had very, very close ties with the Catholic world. At this point, they were sort of, well, not at this point because we passed time and they had to split it up. For a little while, Spain was under Charles V's control, but then he had to split it up because a whole bunch of nobles in Europe thought that it was unfair for the Holy Roman Emperor to control basically 2/3 of the land in Europe. So they had to break it apart with distaff lines and stuff like that. But anyway, the Spanish are going to overwhelmingly stay Catholic, and a lot of that has to do with how recently Spain was delivered from non-Catholic hands. Let's not forget that the Reconquista at this point was only a couple hundred years past, and Spain was like really, really, really big on making sure that it stayed Catholic because it had been not Catholic under Muslim hands. And this is where we get the Spanish Inquisition, where they were forcing everybody to convert, including Jewish people and all kinds of other Christian groups. Anyway, lots of history. So Edict of Nantes is a temporary solution, and it really only lasts for as long as Henry IV is alive, and then stuff goes squirrely. I'm trying to do things a little bit chronologically here, so I know this seems like we're bouncing back and forth a lot, but let's go back to the Holy Roman Empire for a second, because that Peace of Augsburg, when I told you that it didn't sit very well, it didn't sit very well. And what we end up with is the 30 Years' War, which runs... I've really got to stop using those keys. Or maybe I just need to change my hotkeys away from those. From 1618 to 1649. So they were already tired of religious wars. Yeah, they were pretty tired of it. And they had spent a good 100 years or so rooting out anybody that wasn't fervently Catholic. So when the Protestant Reformation hit, it just didn't really find a lot of fertile soil in Spain to grow and develop in the first place. Yeah, so the proof of Augsburg was, or the peace of Augsburg was faulty, right? When you force people to convert, it just doesn't sit very well. There's also now this other group of Calvinists, and there are these Anabaptists who want protection, but the peace of Augsburg did not recognize them, so they didn't have any protection. So we're going to have a war, and this starts with Protestants rebelling against the Holy Roman Imperial Throne. Give me one of them expensive Stream Deck thingies. I've thought about it, and I don't think it would necessarily be that big of a bonus for me. I don't really have a lot of transitions and a lot of fancy things going on in the first place, and I feel like it would probably be a $150 purchase that I didn't really need, if I'm just being honest with it. I have thought about it before, though. So, anyway, Protestants versus Catholics. Go. There are 3 big rounds of these things in the 30 Years' War, and this is going to bring in a lot of different groups. So the Holy Roman Empire is obviously going to split between Catholic forces and Protestant forces. So you're going to see some Protestant Germans fighting on one side and some Catholic Germans fighting on the other side. Just because you're a Catholic or a Protestant doesn't necessarily mean you're going to fight on that side, though. There are also political things to worry about, not just religious things. This is going to start pulling in other countries. You start seeing, like, Sweden gets involved in this, and France gets involved in this, and England gets involved in this, and Italy gets involved in this. And it turns into this big sort of, like, whole deal. It's a really, really big issue. This is going to have really big ramifications. Obviously, this is going to start based around religion, but what's going to come out of this is a new push between European countries to establish international treaties and connections. So if we look at what's going on economically during most of the 15, 16, 1700s, we are operating under a structure that is roughly referred to as mercantilism, where you didn't really want to be friendly with other countries insofar as it cost you anything, because you were supposed to basically be trying to amass power and money and goods and make sure that everything is going into your coffers and not out of your coffers. Anyway, it was very isolationist. You didn't have a lot of really big international partners. But when we're starting to fight wars that span the entire continent of Europe and bring into question colonies abroad, well, maybe it would be better if we did have some international friends. Or maybe we did have some treaties that were multilateral treaties. And again, while this started as politics, this is going to have pretty big political and governmental ramifications. If you know anything about the mess of treaties that existed in Europe at the beginning of World War I, this is sort of where the first idea of that comes from. Now, obviously, it's going to be exacerbated by people like Napoleon and all kinds of stuff like the scramble for Africa and all of that happens in the 1800s. But this is where war starts being a bigger deal than just my Protestants versus my Catholics. Now it's everybody thinking about their own good. And as an example here, France gets involved in the 30 Years' War, but they end up helping the German Protestants. But France is a very Catholic nation. So why does that make sense? Well, it makes sense because France was trying to destabilize the Holy Roman Empire because France wanted to be the most powerful empire on earth. So if I get involved and I weaken my enemy, even though he's the same religion I am, I come out of this better politically. So you start getting this concept of a little bit of nationalism, where my religion is one thing, but my citizenship is another thing. And that's not a light decision to make, right? This is not something that had really been going on very much at the time. So the 30 Years' War starts about religion, but has a really big impact on how government and politics plays out for basically all time since then. 8 million plus people died. We get this really big thing called the Peace of Westphalia, where we settled this issue between the German religious groups. What's really interesting is that the treaty or the Peace of Westphalia also is multilateral in that different countries exchange territory in this. You also see countries like England and Sweden getting the right to ensure Protestant rights inside the Holy Roman Empire, which is kind of weird. So here we see Holy Roman Empire ceding some of its own authority to foreign countries who are also Protestant to make sure that their Protestants felt like they had some guarantors that would back up their rights. You know, so if the Holy Roman Empire decided to start persecuting Lutherans again, Sweden could show up with an army and make sure that the Holy Roman Imperial groups didn't mess with the Lutherans. This is a weird scenario. It turns out to be much different than a lot of people thought that it would at the beginning. A lot of people thought, oh, the crown's going to roll in, they're going to kill a whole bunch of Bavarian Protestants, the Protestants are going to shut up, and then it'll be done in a couple of weeks. We'll be home for Christmas, right? And then it turns into this 30-year war where 7 other countries get involved, and the Holy Roman Empire has to cede some of its authority to other countries. It's weird. It's a new thing, and it's weird. We've done a whole stream about the 30 Years' War, so if you want to go back and find that, you are welcome to scope it out. Let's go back over to France, because I told you that Edict of Nantes wasn't going to hold up very well, and it doesn't. When Henry IV dies, what we see is a new guy taking over. So this is in 1620. Henry IV dies, and we get a new king in France. This guy's name is Louis XIII. Louis is Catholic. He marries a Medici woman from Italy. And if you know anything about the Italians, you'll know that they are very, very Catholic. If you know anything about the Medicis, you'll know that they bought their way into church leadership, not just, like local leadership, but also like big church leadership. And they put themselves in a position to be the princesses and queens of France, right? So Louis doesn't like the fact that the Huguenots got special treatment and they got protection. So what is he going to do? Well, he decides that he's going to start trying to take away their rights, and he's going to start trying to get them to convert back to Catholicism. Huguenots don't like this very much. So the Huguenot rebellions runs from 1620 to 1629, and what you're going to see here is this kind of weird activity where the Protestants begin to form their own little governmental groups. And these little governmental groups are going to be military. Is that not why you are here? Aristotle, what's up, man? Hit him with a winky face, right? Hey everybody that came over from Eris's channel. I hope you all are doing well. If you've been in Eris's channel, you probably know who I am. I'm in Eris's channel all the time. I teach college. We're talking history, Specifically, we're talking history of government and politics. Tonight, specifically in our discussion, we are looking at the relationship between the Protestant Reformation and political changes that happen in Europe because of the Protestant Reformation. So we've talked a lot about early ideas of separation of church and state. We've talked about how some people like Henry VIII decided to merge church and state by saying that he was the head of the Church of England. And now we're actually to the Revolution phase, where people are literally taking up arms against the government to protect their religious rights, and some of the fallout that happens because of this. We just got through talking about the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire. We're not talking about France and the Huguenot rebellions. These run from 1620 to 1629. And they're basically because the Catholic King of France, Louis XIII, didn't really dig the fact that French Protestants, specifically French Calvinists, had power. Fluxstorm, thank you so much for that follow. Welcome to the adventure, my friend. Hope you're doing well. So crazy stuff is happening. The king decides to revoke some of the power of some of the rights of the French Protestants, and the Protestants say, no, we're going to start fighting back. But what's interesting here is how they do this. I've been playing the new indie game. I'm not sure what the new indie game is. But Sociopathogen, welcome in. Luminous, welcome in. Flux, welcome in. Inspector, welcome in. I guess I should do this. If you're not already following my friend Eris, please do. Smart dude. I spend a lot of time on his channel. Good friend. Very bright. You'll enjoy it. Good things. Indiana Jones, maybe? Perhaps. I have not played the new Indiana Jones game. Is it Circle of something or other? Golden Circle. I can't remember what it is. I don't have a computer that'll run it. I don't have a next generation console that'll run it either. So, anyway, how did the Huguenots start this rebellion? Well, they do so interestingly. What they start doing is building these little communities of supporters. And these little groups will start funding their own militaries, and they'll start forming their own little governments. So this isn't necessarily a full cessation from the state of France, but it's a tangible rebellion against the government of France. So we're going to run ourselves our way. We're going to build our own militaries that are going to be dedicated to protecting ourselves. And what's interesting here, and this sort of piggybacks off the same kind of stuff that's happening in the 30 Years' War, is that these little bands of Huguenots inside of France start making arrangements and alliances with other people outside of France. So if there is a big noble in the Holy Roman Empire that just so happens to be right over the border, but the French Protestants want to be Protestant, they can make a deal where they will trade with this German noble, as long as the German noble will stand up and help them fight if the French crown decides to show up and try to stop them. So this again is transcending our concepts between religious and governmental organization. Does having a specific religion imply that we can't be part of the same government? Or is this something that is specific to the Catholic Church, where if we are Protestant, we can't be a part of the Catholic leadership, because the Catholic leadership is based obviously on the Catholic concept of divine right of kings, etc., etc., etc. We're having to make new decisions. We're having to draw different delineations between ourselves. And when we start doing that, we start thinking about people differently. And obviously, this is going to have big impacts. The Huguenot rebellions are pretty bad. This is not going to go well for the Huguenots in France. Louis XIII responds with overwhelming military force and basically crushes all of these. It's not even really close. And it turns out that a lot of these arrangements that you've made with non-French nobles or non-French political groups, or basically anybody outside of France that's Protestant, they aren't going to hold up when the entire Catholic French military shows up. Because France has a really big military, and nobody really wants to fight it. So at the end of these Huguenot rebellions, the Catholic crown is going to come out really strong. They're going to basically reform the governmental clearance for a lot of these Protestants. They're going to allow... So the Edict of Nantes still technically there, but you don't have as many rights. You can't govern yourself, you can't collect your own tax, and you can't have your own militia. So basically, you can say that you're a Protestant if you want to, and we're not going to throw you in jail, but you now have no coverage, and you have no way to assert that with any sort of power. So you don't have political power, you don't have you don't have economic power, and you don't have military power. You basically just get to wear the Huguenot name tag if you want to. This is one of the least successful attempts of European Protestant rebellion. It does not go over very well for the Huguenot rebellions. And by the time we get to Louis XIV, he's pretty much going to just do away with the whole thing, which, starts a whole other issue. All right, so what about England? Now, England has... I could do an entire stream on the English Civil War. We're not going to go through all of the English Civil War. We will mention it sort of here again in passing. And what we're going to look at again is the political and governmental changes. So, if you don't know anything about the English Civil War, this basically starts with a guy named Charles I, who's the King of England. He wanted to raise taxes because the English Civil War... because in England they had a constitutional monarchy. The king could not unilaterally raise taxes. If he wanted to raise taxes, he had to ask Parliament to raise taxes. So when Charles went to Parliament to ask for raised taxes, Parliament did not give him what he wanted. And one of the biggest reasons that Parliament did not give Charles I what he wanted is that Charles had married a French Catholic wife. So the Queen of England was a French Catholic. And a lot of people were really worried that this meant that Charles was going to dissolve the Church of England, push everybody back into Catholicism. That didn't sit well with a lot of people in England. There's also a lot of stuff about unifying Scotland and England, and Scotland and Ireland, and Wales and England, and anyway, there's a lot of stuff that goes on here in the background. But basically, the argument is Charles wants to do whatever he wants to. Parliament won't let him. Parliament gets to the point where they force Charles to sign this document. It's 1628, before the war started, called the Petition of Right, which basically stated that Charles didn't have unlimited power. He couldn't do a lot of the things that he was doing to raise money. This is basically going to cause Charles to shut Parliament down for a decade. It's actually 11 years. So for pretty much all of the 30s, the 1630s, Charles doesn't pay attention to Parliament. Shuts them down, doesn't have meetings with them, doesn't listen to the nobles asking for him to call Parliament up. This is referred to as the tyranny of Charles because, of course, anytime a king does anything without parliamentary approval, it's a tyranny. But when he finally runs out of money and does need to call Parliament back up, Parliament takes that very personally. And when Parliament gets elected in the 40s, there are going to be a lot of people that show up with a chip on their shoulder. And a lot of these people are Puritans. Now, Puritans had existed inside of England since the 1550s. The Puritans were a group that thought that the Church of England needed to be run differently and that they were going to purify the Church of England from its corruption, here both being political corruption and religious corruption. But among these Puritans is a guy named Oliver Cromwell, and Charles is a jerk, and Parliament starts flexing power, and this starts a civil war. And what we see in 1651, well, actually a couple of years before that, Charles gets pushed off the throne. So this is the line of Stuart kings gets removed from power, and Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, is going to establish the Commonwealth of England. So this is technically a period of time where Parliament runs England without a king, but for all real purposes, Oliver Cromwell here is sort of running England like a despotic parliamentarian. And he's a Puritan. And he has very strong ideas about how things should go. And he's going to start passing a lot of laws that are based on his religious ideology. For example, stuff like going to the theater. If you like theater, theaters are pretty much shut down now. You could go to the opera because opera wasn't as scandalous. But if you wanted to go to the theater, basically theaters were shut down because theaters were boisterous. They were places of debauchery. They were places where men dressed up like women, and especially young men who played feminine roles were all considered prostitutes by Puritans because some of them were involved in pederasty. Vanderleen, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome to the adventure. Hope you're doing well. So pure evil, basically. Yes, right. So you couldn't go to the theater. You couldn't go to a public inn and just get sloshed anymore. You weren't supposed to be drunk in public. You were supposed to be very not proprietary. What's the word I'm looking for here? Propitious? You're just supposed to be a Puritan, basically. If you know how the Puritans thought, that's what he tried to make all of the government. Right? Some people take acting seriously. Yeah. Now people go to the theater to prove that they're cultured. Civilized. Moose, I saw you pop in earlier. Good to see you, Moose. So the Puritan Commonwealth was very different politically and not very popular. Taxes were obviously changed. People that didn't fit with the Puritan ethos were kicked out of the government or kicked out of their political positions or kicked out of nobility. Stuff was confiscated a lot. Lots of debt was called, especially if you were a Catholic noble that had any sort of debt, you were expected to pay up immediately. The military kind of underwent some Reformation stuff. But anyway, I found this interesting because a couple of things. Number one, England's Reformation was sort of weird anyway, because instead of trying to establish a difference between church and state, it just merged church and state, right? And one of the biggest problems that the Puritans had with this merging of church and state was that individuals were far from perfect. And if you had a bad king, you didn't necessarily want that bad king to be the head of the government, because that meant that the government was going to be bad. But you definitely didn't want that person to be the head of the religion too, right? Because what's that going to do to your religion? I'll drink to that, right? So when we see the Puritans have a chance to actually do the purifying, you don't really see a lot of purifying. You just see a lot of the same powers and a lot of the same things that they griped about the kings doing happening from their own government. Oh, well, when the king does it, it's bad. But when we do it, it's okay. Right? So there's a lot of really just sort of blatant hypocrisy that happens here. Because we're doing it the right way. Which isn't the right way, right? But anyway, English Civil War is very scary for a lot of reasons if you are not in England, right? Number one, let's say you are the King of France, right? Let's say you're a Louis and you're watching just across the channel as a parliamentary group kicks out their king. How does that make you feel, right? Let's say that you are the Pope and you watch a group of people that in many cases weren't nobles, right? Not already in clergy positions and not Catholic, successfully kick out a king that was supposed to be divinely appointed. Now, how do you feel about that as a pope? This is kind of scary. And if you ever wonder why people like Louis XIV went to such lengths to crush any type of potential opposition, it's because stuff like this was happening, right? So because Europe had become sort of more connected because of these continental sized conflicts, they're now paying a lot more attention to what's happening on the lower levels of the government. So you got to get a little bit paranoid about this. What happens if my people decide that I'm not supposed to be king anymore? Well, we can't do that at all. So what does Louis do? Well, Louis goes and builds his own personal army that's only loyal to him and bankrupts the country in the process of doing it, but then dares anybody to come after him because he's got this giant army of his own, right? So there are definitely going to be ramifications of this. Again, starts political, gets very religious, and then is supposed to be religious but ends up being political, and then having big ramifications, right? Also worth noting, while all of these events that we've talked about tonight are happening, people have been writing things. People have been discussing what is politics. People have been discussing what the role of the sovereign is. People have been talking about what taxation should be. People have been discussing the relationship between local government and federal government. All of these ideas are brewing because of these events. And it shouldn't really be very surprising that when we come back on the next installment of History of Government and Politics, we see an absolute explosion of political ideology. We get so many new ideas in the middle and late 1600s. And these ideas are ones that are really important to a lot of people today. If you consider yourself a democratic socialist, well, socialism really starts with some writers in the middle part of the 1600s. If you consider yourself a libertarian, right, a lot of these liberal, capital L, liberal ideas come from the 1600s. If you consider your, I am the sovereign's body, right? Well, you know, we're not quite to l'estat c'est moi, right? But we're getting there. That is Louis the 15th. No, Louis the 14th. I am the state. But where does that quote even come from, right? That comes from this period of time where we're having to have this discussion about what government is, right? What politics are. How do these things relate with social movements and religious movements and ideological movements and scientific movements? How do we relate to these things when we now have printing presses and more people are becoming literate? How do we relate to this stuff when more people are asking for a representative portion of power within our larger governmental structure, right? The peasants just won't shut up anymore. Now they want to vote because we have this resurgence of concepts of voting rights, right? Sounds like a subject to discuss over coffee. Well, this is definitely a subject that we will discuss extensively. We'll probably have 2 or 3 streams just about really big shifts in political ideology that happened during the Enlightenment. It's fascinating how so much that is discussed in contemporary politics can be reflected at such an earlier time in history. Blue, that is exactly why I'm doing this series. Because a lot of people that are just now getting their toes wet in political and governmental ideology tend to think that these ideas are very new and that these arguments are very new because they themselves are new to them, right? But a lot of this stuff is super old, super duper old. That's why when we started this entire series, the first thing that we talked about was power, right? This idea of collective power and why government is a collective decision about how we as a group use our power. But that's a very anthropological concept, right? But we had to go all the way back into prehistory to get that because that's really where government started, right? The manipulation of power and governmental structures is politics. Where did that word even come from, right? So we went back and talked about all of that stuff. I should point out too easy. Thank you so much for that follow and welcome to the adventure. I do have most of the episodes of this series available on my YouTube channel under a specific playlist called The History of Government and Politics. I think I need to move the last 2 or 3 over. I probably should do that tonight, just to be honest with you. I may or may not do that tonight because I'm horrible about getting off of stream and then wanting to basically not be on stream anymore and not mess with the computer. But I can say that is pretty much all that I had planned on talking about for the night. So if anybody has any additional questions or comments or anything like that, now would be a great time to ask those. Otherwise, we can start kind of looking at a place to raid. New ideas are usually dangerous, right? Humans aren't smart enough to learn from history. We have to suffer the consequences ourselves. Some humans are smart enough to learn from history. The masses have not been taught history properly. I think we have the capacity to learn from history, but it requires dedicated educators and a proper approach to teaching. Right? There's a pedagogical element that is important here. you know, if your exposure to history is a coach in high school that makes you copy off of slides and doesn't actually talk to you about anything and doesn't engage you in any way, you're not going to have a good reaction or background in history. Uh, if you have a dedicated teacher that has a good curriculum that encourages you to think about things, then you can learn from history. We have the capacity to. This country is getting a fresh lesson in the Gilded Age. We are absolutely in the second Gilded Age. There has been a period of time for about the last 10 years that I've wondered what this chapter in history books will be called. I had settled for a little bit on American International Decline, but I think I'm going to go with the Second Gilded Age. If you learn history, it is harder to manipulate you with the old tricks. That's true. That's true. How much of England's own history did the average 17th century English person know? Very little, Luminance. There was no formal education for the public at that point. Any education that the average person had would be through hearsay. The vast majority of English people were illiterate. Books at that time were still being largely controlled by the government. So you couldn't necessarily print whatever you wanted to. England was actually pretty stingy with publication rights, and sometimes the kings themselves would literally put the kibosh on any kind of publishing if they didn't like it or if they were told that they shouldn't like it. So yeah, the average English peasant in the 1600s would know very little about history that they didn't hear in a pub or from grandma. They probably didn't even know very much about what was happening during their lives. A lot of them heard things secondhand or, months or years even after stuff happened. Depending on what part of England you were in, you might not even be directly involved in some of the fighting. You just hear rumors that there's fighting down south, right? There was not a good media at all. Like, newspapers were basically non-existent. You started seeing the earliest version of like printed pamphlets happening around this time, but like daily one sheets that told you the news, nah. I would still bet that the literacy rate in England at that time was probably under 10%, maybe 15%, but not very high. Lately, I've had to revisit irredentism from a historical narrative in East Asia and how it's being reflected in present-day foreign politics. So, Blue, this is a great example of how we are products of our history and our culture, right? We don't act ex nihilo, right? We don't usually come up with brand new things on the spot. We are socialized to think and act certain ways, and those social ties can come from centuries or even millennia in the past, right? We just do things because of the momentum of society. And that's true all over the world. The kicker here is that most people in America especially, and in the West at large, don't learn very much about Eastern history at all, right? Or the stuff that they do learn about Eastern history is only in reflection of Eastern and Western interactions, right? You learn about the Silk Road because China's trading with Rome, or you learn about India because Alexander the Great is conquering India, right? Or you're talking about China because it's the Opium Wars, right? You don't talk about these countries for their own sake or for their own history, which is irksome to me, but also why I argued at my last university to be able to teach Eastern history or Eastern civilizations where it was purely Asian-focused history. And that went over really, really well with the students, but not so great with the administration because It was too popular, and it was taking students out of their classes, which didn't sit well with the department chair. Curious partially because you wonder how much of the average attendees at one of Shakespeare's plays would have known about the topics in said plays. So this would be way post Shakespeare. By the time we get to the English Civil War, almost 100 years past Shakespeare. No, not 100 years. Not 100 years. Several decades, though. Anyway, a lot of Shakespeare's humor was rather lowbrow, and he actually got critiqued a lot by his local contemporaries for being, the nobody that didn't have a peership or a lordship. He didn't have a name. He didn't have a coat of arms. He was just this podunk guy from Stratford upon Avon, right? He was just a nobody married to a nobody, who did nobody things. His later plays, especially after he got popular, did have a lot more of the sort of high political dealings, but it's because by that point he was getting a lot more rich people show up to his shows. But the humor itself was usually something that you could pick up in the play, even if you didn't know the allusion. So this is allusion, Allusion. So if you didn't know to what he was alluding, you could still get the funny ha-ha, because he would write it in such a way that everybody would still be able to ha-ha about it. Luminance was really fascinating. I don't know how much you know or how much you've done research on English theater stuff, but when the Stuart line comes back, you have this really weird period of time where the theater comes back and it just goes bonkers. So there's this little period of time in the late 1600s, early 1700s, and it's just weird stuff with Dryden. I can't remember everybody off the top of my head right now. Anyway, I could talk about that stuff forever, and I'm way off topic right now. How about the Shane Speaks age? I'm not that big. If you learn history, you're doomed to watch other people get manipulated with the old tricks. That's true. Was the first printing press in the Middle East? No, the first printing press was in China during the Song Renaissance, almost 400 years before the Europeans came up with it with Gutenberg. So fully movable type printing press, actually invented by the Chinese way before it was invented in Europe. It just didn't get all the way over because the Song dynasty, which was the heart of the Chinese Renaissance, basically then got curb stomped by the Mongols. And a lot of that stuff was lost for about 100 years, which is unfortunate, but I can't definitely remember never learning about the East. Yeah, we didn't get any of that stuff. Haven't done much at all, sadly, but there's definitely a gap we'd like to fill. It's interesting stuff. I really like theater and theater history, but I'm a giant nerd, and I pretty much watch and read and try to learn everything. But that's what the curse of, being the non-specialist is. If you don't specialize, you have to learn everything. And that's fine too. But specifically here, we're looking at Restoration theater, or Restoration comedy is what the Wikipedia page is. I'll put this here for you. Anyway, basically, once the Puritans got run out of power and the king came back, the theater decided that they were going to go bat crap crazy, and they started letting women be in the theater, like actually like women playing women's parts. A lot of the plays became like super hypersexualized because, of course, the Puritans weren't going to let anything even kind of sexy happen. So the response is, let's just go full bore on sexual innuendo, and we're not even going to try to make it very much innuendo. We're just going to do the sexy part out loud. It was just super bawdy and really bad puns. It was basically the preacher's kid that got to college and experienced life. That was Restoration comedy. It's fascinating stuff. Really, really funny. It doesn't have a lot of staying power, and you don't see a lot of the plays that were written during that period still being performed now because they're not really that great in like the sense of like great theater, but it was a really, really fun time. Yes, horrible puns, Tad. And hey, Allie, good to see you. Restoration drama's funny, funny stuff. Funny, funny stuff. All right. To where shall we raid? Maybe we should raid somebody new. Let's do that. We haven't raided anybody new in a long time. Let's see who's streaming under the politics tag. Just chatting. Politics. Oh, I'm really important is streaming. I'm really important doesn't respond to me when I type in his chat, so we won't go there. Let's see who's going on. Wow, there's a streamer who's literally called Why I Hate Politics. I think we're going to go raid Why I Hate Politics.
I want to work with them. They don't want to be implicated.
I mean, sure, that sounds great. Yeah, Ali, I've been going since 7, so you know, not to shoehorn colonialism into the way that surface level academics would lean into, but it does rival that kind of perspective in which you learn everything of the East in the lens of how different it is from the West. Yes, exactly. And I don't think that's shoehorning colonialism in it at all. It's just being indoctrinated into the viewpoint of the one side, right? A master's essay focused on isolation of Japan in the Edo period. Oh, dude, Blue, we could talk about that like crazy. I love Japanese history. I connected to the cultural aspect of isolated Japanese society against the rebuilding from the U.S. Yeah, we could talk about that. I've done streams on all that stuff. Peers were upset that the policy strategy could be called upon a story. Yeah, exactly. Right. So let's go raid Why I Hate Politics. I've never been to Why I Hate Politics stream. Did it actually work? No, it didn't. Why didn't it work? It says username invalid. It's not invalid. I literally copied and pasted it. Maybe it doesn't like it because I copied and pasted it. Username invalid. How can it be invalid? I'm literally copying the username out of the URL. Hey, there we go. All right. So let's go say hi. I don't know what we're walking into, but it seems fun. Um, Apologies if it isn't, but I'll see everybody around. Hope you have a good one. I do hope that I'll be on this weekend working on some model stuff, but we'll see how the weekend goes. Um, Let me make sure that I say thanks to everybody. So thanks to everybody for tonight. So Matt resubscribed, Claire resubscribed. So thanks everybody. Kyle resubscribed. Thanks for all of our new follows. Also, thanks to everybody that supports me in other ways. You can see everybody that's on my Patreon here. You can see everybody that has sent me books here. Appreciate everybody for hanging out. Hope you have a good one. Let's go do a raid. So if you've got some emotes you can throw in chat, that's cool. But until then, everybody, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.